Hello, welcome, Glenn Greenwald. We are so happy to have you.
We've been long awaiting this interview.
I'm so happy to be here. I'm a little irritated that it took this long for you to finally have me on, but better late than never.
Yeah, well,
How many people have you had on before me?
Oh, just like one. We had one show.
It was
So
more
I'm
like
the second
40,
guest.
right?
More like 40, okay, yeah.
No, exactly.
But you
I
were
think
one
it is
of our
more
top
like 40.
choices, and you're the top part of our top 40.
Yeah.
And we wanted to have you on in the beginning. So it was just actually a question of your schedule.
Okay, I feel better.
Yeah.
We should probably we plunge into the news of the day. What's your take on the Warren thing, the Warren-Bernie thing? I mean, before we get into other things in the last 3 years, there's such a crazy story that's blowing up right now. What did you think about CNN's story and what's going on? It's so crazy.
So I have to confess that I was internet free for almost the entire day until we did this interview, so I don't actually know the story that you're referencing. So could you fill me in and I'll let you know what I think?
Oh, yeah. So the story is that Warren is claiming that in a meeting a year ago, Sanders told her, a private one-on-one meeting, Sanders told her that he didn't think a woman could win the presidential elections.
And she only decided to reveal this explosive and incriminating statement now.
The day before a debate.
Also, the CNN story was sourced to 4 people. They had 2 people familiar with the matter, 2 people who had spoken to Warren, but the story all came from Warren. And,
there were
and then
2
Bernie
people in the
denied
room.
it. Just the coverage of it was great.
Yeah.
If you didn't see it, it's not important. But it's the whole campaign is kind of going crazy now. Did you anticipate this reaction, like to when Bernie rose in the polls, that this kind of thing would start to happen?
He did.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say is, there have long been built-in mechanisms in both parties designed to prevent candidates who are perceived to be outside of the realm of establishment control or mainstream and orthodox thought. And they activate those mechanisms when it seems like a candidate who is outside of their control is threatening to actually win the nomination. In 2016, you saw that in the Republican Party. They did everything they possibly could to prevent Trump from winning. And he did have to overcome a lot of those institutional obstacles. And that's what made his victory so kind of extraordinary, so remarkable. And of course, Bernie, as someone who's not a Democrat technically, has been critical of the party for many years, whose opinions are adverse to the factions that fund the party. If he got anywhere near the nomination, or even polls suggesting that he could win, as polls now are suggesting, they're going to do everything literally to sink his candidacy, and that's obviously what this is.
Yeah, I was just looking. You tweeted about a John Kerry interview where you said that.
Yeah, I mean, John Kerry, went on, I guess, Face the Nation or one of those shows that nobody under 80 watches anymore, and said, Joe Biden didn't really support the war. He was just trying to give George Bush leverage. I remember in 2002 watching Biden when he was the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, advocating for that war, the one that John Kerry is now lying and claiming he didn't support and accusing Bernie of deceit and being misleading. That's how desperate they are, that Joe Biden's vote in favor of the Iraq war didn't really mean that he was in favor of the Iraq war and Bernie is lying. They'll do anything and say anything to prevent Bernie from winning.
Yeah.
Is this whole period with Iraq coming back into the news? You wrote about this years ago, right after the election in 2016, that there was a merger of neoconservatives and the Democratic Party that was becoming more formalized. You wrote about the alliances for securing democracy with Jamie Fly and some of the ex-Obama folks. Is this coming to fruition now? I mean, like you're seeing David Frum and Bill Kristol, they had these prominent roles in the press. It's something that you've spent a lot of time on, and I feel like is an underplayed phenomenon.
Yeah, I mean, even before Trump, there were articles about how neocons were planning to migrate from the Republican Party, which was becoming increasingly isolationist, as evidenced by things like the relative success of the Ron Paul movement in 2008 and 2012. I mean, he was going into places like South Carolina and Iowa, and saying that the Iraq War was not just a mistake strategically, but a moral evil, and was, getting 25% of the vote and huge amounts of evangelical voters. It was clear that neoconservative militarism and ideology were becoming increasingly unwelcome in the Republican Party. And obviously, Donald Trump exploited that sentiment to great success. He ran against all of those wars. And neocons are, if nothing else, very kind of keyed in to political trends and knowing they always shift to whatever faction will best serve their agenda. And before Trump was even a thought in 2014, people were writing op-eds that with the anticipation that Hillary was going to be the Democratic nominee, neocons were going to have a party in the Democratic Party, because she was much more pro-imperialism, pro-war, wanting to topple Assad, criticizing Obama for not arming Ukraine. She was kind of the dream of neocons. And, you guys and me are much less popular in mainstream Democratic precincts than David Frum and Bill Kristol are. They are stars of the Democratic Party because their form of militarism has regained cachet, largely due to the militarism and jingoism surrounding Russiagate, but also now through the Obama presidency, which kind of reanimated the idea that the use of drones, bombing countries repeatedly, is a good thing. And it's incredibly ironic because in 2008, the main difference that ultimately distinguished Obama from Clinton was her support for the Iraq War. That's really what sunk her candidacy in 2008. And now Democrats seem willing to say, not only is that no longer disqualifying, but it's almost like a positive that Joe Biden supported the Iraq War. And I do think it's reflective of what the Democratic Party on the mainstream establishment levels is becoming.
You've pointed this out in the past that another thing that separated Obama from Clinton in that election in 2008 was the first moment was when he stood up and said he was willing to talk to people in Cuba, in Syria, to talk to rogue states, and
North
Hillary
Korea,
said that she wouldn't. And obviously that's come up again in this election cycle. Do you think that the mainstream Democrats just don't remember all this history and how this didn't go over well in previous elections, or they do remember it and are just are trying to get people to think that this is the way you win elections, is to be tough on these issues?
I don't think Democrats have any consistent. I don't think Democrats, like broadly speaking, obviously, have any principles, any consistent principles. They're incredibly craven. They just believe whatever the moment and convenience demands that they believe. I mean, that moment in 2007 at the Democratic presidential debate when Obama was asked, not only would you be willing to meet and negotiate with the leaders of North Korea, Syria, Cuba, Venezuela, and Iran, but would you be willing to meet with no conditions? Just let's sit down and meet. And he said, yeah, of course I would. And Hillary Clinton mauled him for it, saying that was incredibly reckless and irresponsible and it would empower tyrants. And I remember that moment so vividly because that was one of the very first moments when I started thinking that Obama would actually be a good president, certainly better than Hillary Clinton. And that was a energizing moment for the people who supported Obama, which obviously ended up being a majority of Democrats over Hillary Clinton. That's almost like a radical view. It shouldn't be, but it is in U.S. politics. And it's been amazing to watch, when Trump went to North Korea, or when he proposed meeting with other leaders of the bad countries, Democrats reacted as though that was an incredibly reckless and irresponsible thing to do. They adopted Hillary Clinton's critique of Obama in 2007, which in 2007 caused them to side with Obama because they don't have any consistent principles. They just decide what they're going to believe at any moment. And I also think that this increasing militarism in the Democratic Party has kind of made things like sitting down and talking to leaders of the bad countries be much more stigmatized than it was, say, 12 years ago.
Hassan Piker did a great video on that where he cross-cuts between Fox News responding to Obama's comments and Dems responding to MSNBC and Dems responding to Trump's comments or decision about North Korea. And you see it's just like both. And of course, the Fox News praises Trump for this stuff, which would be fine if they praised Obama for it. It's total. It's just nice. What I like is how bipartisan the
Stupidity
bullshit
is?
and
Yeah.
inconsistency is. It warms the heart seeing that like MSNBC and Fox are really just two different sides of the same coin.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's interesting, and I know my saying this means that I'm a Ku Klux Klan leader, but the reality is that that Fox is much more critical of Trump than MSNBC was of Obama. And I guess I should by that specify that obviously there are exceptions. Sean Hannity is one of the worst partisan apparatchiks and hacks anywhere on the planet. Joe Scarborough was on MSNBC, obviously criticizing Obama as kind of the token conservative in the morning. But, if you look at like just the nighttime host and like the kind of star opinion journalists that define the networks, clearly the Fox stars are more critical of Trump than MSNBC stars were of Obama. And not by much. I mean, they also are pretty craven, but I think on balance, that's the case.
And the point is we expect, right? Or like the consensus among liberals is that MSNBC is the thoughtful, not craven, not lying network, as opposed to Fox.
Who expects that?
I mean, who does? I don't know. Like, libs,
I don't.
Libs. I know, but yeah.
But it has been a disillusioning. It's been an odd experience the last few years. I don't know if you feel the same way that I have noticed that Fox, even the Daily Caller, like some of these outlets, they're getting kind of back into the business of reporting a little bit. As opposed to where they were even 10 years ago. There's a little bit more balance in that part of that sector of the media. I don't know if you feel the same way.
Yeah, and I know this is going to mean that I'm not only a Ku Klux Klan leader, but also a loyalist of the Nazi Party. But the reality is, which I think is already established anyway, so it doesn't matter. But I think that a lot of the best reporting on Russiagate came from places like the Daily Caller, and even from occasionally from certain programs on Fox. And so I think the media landscape and the media ecosystem is a lot more complex than people typically claim that it is. And, just to go back to the MSNBC comment, I think, and Matt, I think we've talked about this before. I think you've talked about it before publicly. I certainly have. I remember in 2006, 2007, the first shows that I started doing were Rachel Maddow's Air America shows. And we used to spend hours talking about how shitty the Democrats were from the left. How terrible Harry Reid was and how like awful Chuck Schumer was and just how like in general the Democrats are corporatist and like appeasing Dick Cheney all the time and without any principles. And even in 2008, 2009, I used to be on Rachel's show all the time. And a big part of what we were doing was critiquing Obama. And then at some point, the $10 million a year contract that she gets from Comcast and just like hanging out with Claire McCaskill and Nancy Pelosi and whoever else, she hangs out with, transformed her from this really interesting, smart, independent voice into a still smart, but like incredibly unprincipled partisan hack. And I think that's kind of what you guys might have been referring to, which I share, which is the idea that there's still a part of me that kind of like keeps expecting the people at MSNBC who I used to like and admire to start being independent, critical-minded analyst again, as opposed to DNC spokespeople.
Right.
When was the first moment did you have a moment when you first thought that there was something off about the Russia story going back 3-4 years ago?
I think that just first of all, just intuitively, the whole script of Russia is infiltrating American politics, the Kremlin is manipulating U.S. discourse, our political enemies are secretly loyal to the Russian government. All of that just kind of like as an intuition is kind of just an impressionistic reaction falls very poorly with me because it's so redolent of the Cold War script that the far right, led by people like Bill Buckley and Joe McCarthy and J. Edgar Hoover, used for decades against liberals. It's the same script, even though the Russian government is of a different character.
Right.
But still, even now, you hear people regularly you hear Adam Schiff, he constantly talks about the KGB in the present tense. And the same kind of narrative, Donna Brazil has a tweet where she says, like, the communists are now ruling our politics, meaning the Russian government.
If only.
Yeah, they're controlling the narrative or something like that, right?
Yeah, are controlling our narrative. So just instinctively, I was resistant to and kind of wary of that narrative. But then I think like the moment when I really felt like things had gone completely off track was when Trump, being Trump, trolling in the most obviously frivolous kind of facetious way, stood up at that press conference. And when he was asked about Russian involvement, he did his standard tactic of deflecting it onto Hillary by saying, I don't know if the Russian government is actually hacking. Maybe they can find Hillary's 38,000 deleted emails, which was obviously clearly just a joke designed to distract attention away from himself and remind everybody what he always was reminding people of, which was
crooked Hillary.
Crooked Hillary. And the media treated that like it was a genuine request, as if like he was colluding secretly with Russia. He would put his request not through the secret red phone to Vladimir Putin, but by standing in front of 1,000 cameras and millions of people and making a serious request. And when I started seeing stuff like that, like that they were treating what was obviously a dumb, trolling, off-the-cuff comment as some kind of treasonous request that the Russians intervened in the election, notwithstanding that the Russians supposedly then started looking for those emails after Trump said that. That's the claim anyway. That's when I started realizing that at the very best, this was wildly exaggerated hysteria and the kind of just jingoistic fear-mongering that U.S. politics has been plagued with since at least the end of the World War II.
You get a lot of crap for appearing on Tucker Carlson. Interestingly enough, like when you do appear on his show, you point out what's all the behavior of Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, and then you get called a fascist or a fascist enabler, and of course,
or a white supremacist,
And I want to congratulate you, by the way, as being one of the first Jewish Grand Wizards and Nazi high-ranking Nazi journalists, right? You've done so much for our people, But the irony is that, like you've said this before, how Bolsonaro is actually much more of a fascist than Trump is. So when you do go on Tucker Carlson, you've talked about how much of a threat he is, and you're one of the only voices that has ever done that on cable news. But you're living under this fascist. I mean, do you think that people? It's kind of a leading question. Obviously, I'm betraying my fandom of you. But do you have anything to say to people who accuse you of engaging in fascistic propaganda,
enabling Fox,
Yeah, I mean, like, first of all, I'll go on any show, right, as evidenced by the fact that I'm here, even though you guys are Kremlin agents. You guys are Kremlin agents. You're Trump supporters.
No standards at all.
Yeah.
No standards of any kind, and I'm still willing to talk to you, right?
Yeah.
So, like, that kind of proves that I am consistent in my standards, that I'm talking to Katie Halpert and Matt Taibbi. I mean, what if I do that? What don't I do?
Yeah, exactly.
But, I just two things, which is, like, number one, I think that if you're engaged politically, as we are, as our work necessarily means we have chosen to be, you have the obligation, if you believe in the things that you're advocating, if you believe in the convictions that you hold, if you believe that the insights you have developed or the expertise you possess are things that are important for people to hear, I think you have the obligation to maximize the number of people with whom you're communicating rather than minimizing the number of people with whom you're communicating. And the idea that we should deliberately set about only to speak with those people who already agree with our worldview or ideology and avoid talking to anybody who thinks differently from us is insanity to me. It's just, when I listen to these arguments about why we shouldn't go on Fox, why we shouldn't go on Tucker Carlson, notwithstanding that he has by far the largest audience of any cable news host in the country. I try and listen, I try and understand the claims, and it comes off like sounding like a crazy person when I listen to people who are making that argument. Like, there's 4 million people over there, and you have the choice to either communicate with them and convince them of the things you
Yes,
believe,
exactly.
or just refuse to talk to them on the grounds that they might think things differently than you, and forever cede the opportunity to have a channel of communication where you can actually convince, 5%, 10%, which is a huge number of people, to be open to the things that you think. And all the arguments about like how you give credibility to Tucker Carlson's show. I haven't been on that show in 8 months. I've checked his ratings. They seem to be pretty good without me. Like, I don't feel like I'm the one who is responsible for the success of his show. His show is successful whether I go on or not. The question is whether I'm going to avail myself of that opportunity. And then the other thing is like this whole, resistance costume, this kind of like
Cosplay,
prancing around as like resistance warriors ever since Trump. I mean, I remember that kid who works for Neera Tanden, who like for a few months every day was posting like, I have not yet been arrested by the Trump government for my political views. This tweet will repeat itself every day, as though one day he was going to be like in a black site, and like we would know that just because the tweet didn't appear, and we would be like, oh my God, where's that Ian kid? He's been like abducted by Trump because he's such like a scary threat to fascist power.
It's been a day since he tweeted, call the authorities, except they're
it's so offensive
it really
when you
is.
like actually read about people who have risked their liberty and their lives to stand up to actual fascism. And I mean, obviously the fact that, I live in Brazil, that I was able with my colleagues this year to do a story exposing grave corruption at the highest levels of the Bolsonaro government, that I was threatened repeatedly by Bolsonaro himself and the government with prison, with arrest, with violence, just like the primary target of this fascist movement, makes me very kind of indifferent to claims by people who have never actually stood up to fascism or confronted it or risked anything in any way to do it, the way that we also did in the Snowden case when we were threatened with prison as well by James Clapper and Peter King and all kinds of people in various governments around the world, where we couldn't leave the country we were working in because we would be arrested if we did. I'm just very indifferent to the accusations by people who have never done any of that I'm a fascist enabler or whatever. I'll go on whatever fucking shows I want, and I'll talk to whoever I want. And I just, I'm open to arguments about why I shouldn't, but I've never heard even a cogent reason why I shouldn't, let alone a convincing one.
In a related question, do you think journalists have a responsibility to be contrary to go against popular assumptions? I've had this discussion with other reporters, and some people say, like, for instance, in the age of Trump, that instinct should go out the window. It's too important to impose him. We shouldn't be contrary. But I just wondered what you've been criticized for being too contrarian often. What's your take on that?
I mean, I think, and I'm not just saying this to like be obsequious, but I think that your book, which I praised, pretty effusively because I read it from the first word to the last, I think within like the last 6 weeks, Hate Inc. is incredibly enlightening about what journalism is actually supposed to do, the reason why it's protected in the Constitution, the reason why democracy depends upon a free press, what the traditional role of journalists has been, and you talk a lot about, your father was a journalist whose like worldview you admire and were influenced by, and you have insight into what journalism in the prior generation was. And I think it's incredibly enlightening, and it influenced. Now, we've talked for years about exactly that, and it's influenced me a lot, which is when you have a conventional set of assumptions that the elite class more or less unanimously has adopted, and those assumptions go essentially unquestioned by people with a public platform because they're afraid of deviating from prescribed orthodoxies or norms, that's very dangerous, because the history of human intellect and beliefs and power is that human beings err all the time, and orthodoxies have to be subjected to critical scrutiny. And the role of the journalist, in its most noble sense for me, is to inform the public, which oftentimes means questioning the most sacred pieties. And that necessarily means that the journalist is going to be outside of the scope of the halls of power and mainstream popularity, because in a lot of ways, the role of the journalist is to be an outsider, questioning and challenging and scrutinizing and investigating rather than appeasing and placating and serving the orthodoxies of the most powerful. And obviously Donald Trump is a powerful person. He occupies the White House. His party is in control of the Senate. He's backed by a lot of rich people. Nonetheless, the mainstream orthodoxy and piety of the great majority of the kind of mainstream media, the most influential media, is, supportive of the Russiagate narrative, extremely hostile to Trump, in favor of the Democrats regaining power. And there's a lot of assumptions embedded in those views that are highly questionable. And I think our role is to question them and not serve them in order to become more popular.
It seems to me like there are a couple of different, just kind of talking about the critiques of appearing on Fox. And I've appeared on Fox a couple times. And there is, to me, an interesting spectrum. Like, you can go on Fox I had it easy because I went on to defend Ilhan Omar. So I was just fighting with Laura Ingraham. And then I was fighting with some Republican about immigration stuff. And then there's the...
Well, they're not automatically agreeing, but...
No, well, I mean, but I don't say that in a bad... Okay, you are... Well, the bigger picture, the bigger issue is that that's where you're allowed to talk about what you're saying. And this is what gets missed, gets lost. The issue isn't like, look at this person who goes on Fox. The issue is, look at this news landscape where you can't go on MSNBC or CNN if you say anything that's at all against the orthodoxy or against the grain. And that is like, that's the real travesty, or the real thing that people should be outraged about.
I guess the question is, have you been invited to talk about Russiagate on any of those other networks?
Yeah.
Right, exactly. I think this is a great question. It's also like central to this whole debate, right? Because first of all, I'm, a very vociferous critic of MSNBC and CNN, and I have been for a long time. I'm also a vociferous critic of a lot of what the Washington Post and the New York Times do, although I also think they do a lot of good journalism, but I've been vociferously critical of a lot of what they do. Nonetheless, if the New York Times or the Washington Post invites me to write an op-ed, which they've done in the past, that's kind of consistent with their worldview. The New York Times recently asked me to write one about the threat that Bolsonaro poses to Brazilian democracy because they're obviously hostile to Bolsonaro. I wrote the op-ed consistent with my beliefs. I didn't go out of my way to attack the New York Times just because I was writing in the pages of the New York Times. I wrote about the topic they invited me to opine on in as honest of a way as I could. I didn't think about, should I please the New York Times or should I anger the New York Times? I just used the platform to say what I think about the thing they invited me to talk about. Same with the Washington Post. I've gone on CNN and MSNBC dozens of times. On a few occasions, I've attacked MSNBC and CNN only when the situation called for it. Like when, I was there to debate something that they had done and I criticized what they did. I never went on MSNBC and CNN and just gratuitously ignored the question and started attacking them for things that they did that I thought were wrong. A lot of times I went on MSNBC and CNN because I was used by them to advocate a view that they wanted to promote. When Fox asked me to go on, I don't think about, should I go on and fight with Tucker Carlson? Should I go on and fight with Laura Ingraham? I go on and they ask me a question and I say what I think. Is Fox using me? Yes. I'm using Fox too, like I said before. And as Matt suggested, I can't go on MSNBC and CNN because they banned all of us who are Russiagate critics. And so I'm not going to accept a worldview that says that if you have opinions that Rachel Maddow and Wolf Blitzer dislike and want to suppress, you have the moral obligation to stay off television. That's not something that I'm willing to accept. And it's not my fault that MSNBC and CNN censored critics of their false narrative about Russiagate. If you're angry that I'm not on CNN and MSNBC, but instead on Fox, don't criticize me for that. Go yell at Rachel Maddow and Anderson Cooper. Or Jeff Zucker and whoever, Phil Griffin. I think that's an important point.
And also, first of all, how dare you attack a lesbian woman, a woman, and a gay man by going after Anderson Cooper and Rachel Maddow? You're toxic, homophobic, anti-Semitic, fascistic Bernie bro.
I added Jeff Zucker and Phil Griffin just to cover my bases.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. The fact that, for instance, Tucker Carlson, it's this vicious cycle because Tucker Carlson will question Russiagate. He'll question the Russiagate narrative. He's the only person, he and Laura Ingrams actually, who questioned the justification for Syria. And yet, because they say that, if you or if I or Matt, if we say, maybe there wasn't evidence, maybe the evidence isn't credible, maybe Mattis himself said there wasn't evidence of Assad doing a certain thing. If we say that, now we're Carlsonists or Ingramsian or Fox Newsists or fascists. It's like, yeah, that's the problem. The only people who are saying this are on the right because other people on the left either ideologically oppose interventionism and imperialism or they're too afraid of being smeared as aligned with those people on the right.
Yeah, I mean, who is the only cable host who routinely and aggressively critiques the monopolistic power of Facebook and Google over our political life, over our discourse, over our economy, over our technological independence? It's right-wing politicians and right-wing hosts on Fox. Who are the only people on primetime cable news who vehemently attacked Trump for bombing Syria?
Right.
It was Tucker Carlson. Who are the only people on cable news really criticizing him for essentially elevating the risk of war with Iran? I guess some MSNBC hosts are doing that, but within a very kind of muted strategic rationale. It's not done the way the generals want.
Formulaic, yeah.
Yeah, very formulaic and just like doing it because it's Trump and trying to almost find reasons to disagree with it. Whereas Tucker Carlson is going on and saying, we have no business and no right to be going to war with Iran. It doesn't benefit the United States or the American people in any way. So politics is about building coalitions issue by issue. You can join hands with them. Dennis Kucinich and Ron Paul join hands to pass a bill to audit the Fed. Even though Dennis Kucinich finds a lot of Ron Paul's views and vice versa completely, reprehensible. So you can agree with Tucker Carlson on Russiagate and imperialism and vehemently condemn his rhetoric on immigration, as I've done many times. It's not hard.
Right. Yeah, it's really not hard.
In the last few years, I was wondering if you could talk about your experience with the media. I've often felt, and I've gone through this a little bit, but not on the scale that you have, that the other members of the press are in a way trying to make an example out of you. Like they're talking about you in a certain way that to me feels like a message sent to other journalists. Like if you take this stance, you're going to get the Greenwald treatment. You're going to be Glenn G.R.U. Wald on Twitter. You're going to get the bane of your existence feature written about you. I just wondered what your take on that and whether you've thought about that in the last few years.
Yeah, it's been fascinating because when the Snowden story happened, I was obviously not part of the media elite, right? I was always a critic of it. I didn't start in the newsroom at the New York Times or the Washington Post. I never had worked for a major media outlet before until, 9 months earlier when I became a columnist at The Guardian. But even then I was kind of an outsider. I was in Brazil. I wasn't in the newsroom. So when, I was able, along with Laura Poitras, to break a story of that magnitude, they kind of had to do things like give the reporting a Pulitzer and a Polk and kind of a little bit welcome me into their castle, even though they so didn't want to. It pained them so deeply. They were kind of forced to. And, it did obviously elevate my platform and my credibility and my visibility and my ability to be heard and my influence contrary to what they wanted. When Russiagate happened and I became one of, a very few skeptics and critics of the prevailing narrative, they obviously viewed that as their chance that they've long wanted to eject me from the halls of decency and mainstream acceptability and to kind of put a label on my head that said that I was radioactive, not only to finally expel me from their sacred realm, which was a big part of their motive, but more importantly, as you suggested, Matt, to make an example, to kind of Matt, you've built a big following, a big audience. You have a degree of independence that young journalists don't have. The same is true for me. We're kind of lucky in that we're able to take risks and to incur their wrath without having our careers destroyed. But for younger journalists, the last thing you want is to kind of stick your head up and question their most, prized pieties, because they will destroy your reputation. And those two articles that you referenced, one in New York Magazine, which was like reasonably fair in a lot of ways, but the framing and like all the art and everything else was designed to make me seem like a demon. And the headline was just so like blatantly deceitful and unfair. Like, does this man know more than Robert Mueller? As though I was claiming that.
I mean, you're like Emmanuel Goldstein basically in that article. I mean,
yeah. Well, and then the far worse one was the New Yorker, which essentially had no purpose but to basically say, we're going to dissect him, and we're going to show you that the reason he won't admit that this conspiracy happened, that everyone knows that happened because the evidence is so overwhelming. The reason he's denying it is because he's psychologically ill.
Right.
He had this like terrible childhood. He's angry and resentful about how he was treated when he was young because he was gay. He was estranged from his father. He's like so filled with anger. It was very like psychologically demeaning and a very subtle and absolutely pathologizing my views on Russiagate. And those two articles together were really like the mainstream media's way of saying, we had to let him in for a while, but we're now decreeing that he's now off limits. And obviously young journalists see that and they can't sustain that. I mean, it's hard, even if you do have a big platform. You start wondering, how is this going to affect my future opportunities? Yeah. How is this going to affect how my books are talked about? How is this going to affect my ability to, speaking appearances, whatever. It affects you, but like I think we're in the position where we kind of have the responsibility, given the platform we've built, to show people that journalists have to do that. Like if journalists don't do that, don't go against the grain when they believe it, then who is going to, And so I feel like on the one hand, it didn't really succeed in destroying me, though they tried. My involvement in this expose about Brazil kind of undermined their efforts because it's, one of the most important journalism stories of 2019, undoubtedly, and has been covered as such and discussed as such. But I also think that, any fair-minded person has to admit that the way the Mueller probe ended, with not one single person, an American, being criminally charged with conspiring with the Russians over the election, which was the accusation that initiated the entire scandal, and with the Mueller report concluding that there was no evidence to establish that conspiracy took place, any fair-minded person would have to say, not necessarily that we were right about everything, but that our skepticism was vindicated, and that the mainstream view of this certainty of the inevitability of all these people being arrested for criminally conspiring with Russia was debunked. And I think that, in a lot of ways, I don't know what impact it'll have on my future professional opportunities or whatever, but I'm really proud of what I did. And I think you ought to be too, both of you, for being willing to speak out. And like Katie is a good example where, you're young, you're starting your journalism career, and it's really risky to do those kind of things. And they purposely have those punishment mechanisms in place to deter people from any dissent. And I really got to see it up close and personal and firsthand with what they tried to do to me in 2017 and 2018 as a result of my Russiagate skepticism.
Well, also 2019 in Brazil, right? I mean,
right, from the other side.
It's a different thing, obviously.
Right?
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting because, like, I remember one of the lines from the New York Magazine article, which is that, like, he doesn't do any real reporting anymore. He just like throws rocks at the media. I remember Ken Delanian was like, yeah, he doesn't do any reporting. He's just like an asshole who just like criticizes us. Because for them, real reporting means you call the CIA and like you write down what they say.
And you're like, even.
Yeah, or they call you in Ken Delanian's case. And like you go and like obey what they tell you to do. That's what they mean by real reporting. But the fact that like, New York Times, The Washington Post, AP, The Guardian, all covered this journalistic expose, this series of articles that we did that provoked threats and dangers and attacks as one of the most important journalism stories of the year, which it clearly was because of the importance of Brazil, with the Amazon, with Bolsonaro. kind of destroyed that ability to destroy me, because everybody had to acknowledge that this was real journalism in every sense of the word.
Has anyone apologized to either of you, or if not apologized, like acknowledged that you were right about certain things? Anyone who really went after you?
No, I mean, Matt, have you had that? I don't,
No.
I think that, once people, I think the hardest thing to do is when you're really invested in something, if you really believe in something, if you really form a conviction about it, to admit that it was wrong all along.
Right.
And I'm sure there are people who would hear me say that and would say, oh my God, that's such projection. He's the one who got invested in this skepticism about Russiagate and ultimately got proven true. But the reality is, no matter what else is true, that no one was charged with criminally conspiring with Russia over the election, and the Mueller report concluded that there was no evidence to establish that conspiracy took place, which was the crux of the entire debate all along, and any honest person would admit that. So I don't need apologies. I am very comfortable looking at myself in the mirror as a result of what happened, and I hope you guys are too.
And
We're very comfortable looking at you in a mirror. But
Thank you, Katie.
There has been some softening, though. I mean, like, you look at the Eric Wemple series recently in the Washington Post, and he's, I'm actually surprised by how aggressive those stories were, about Rachel and about some of the, looking back at the Russia reporting. Did that surprise you? I didn't think that the Post would run something like that.
It's so ironic that you bring that up, because one of the things that I didn't actually agree with you in your book about was you essentially predicted, I don't know when that book was finished, but I assume it was
Hate Inc.?
Much earlier in 2019. Yeah, Hate Inc. That they were going to turn Rachel Maddow into their Judy Miller. Basically, we're going to pretend that this is just one person who went over the line and was journalistically reckless, while the rest of the media, essentially was very responsible. And that's been Margaret Sullivan's theme.
Right.
The cable news personalities aren't really journalists. The serious reporters at the New York Times and the Washington Post got it right. Trying to isolate her was your prediction. And I thought, you know what? I think Rachel Maddow is too valuable of an asset and too popular for that to happen. But I think you actually turned out to be right. That Eric Wemple column was very aggressive in repudiating what she did, and that did surprise me. But I also felt like it was kind of a fulfillment of your expectation that they were going to try and isolate her and scapegoat her as a means of saving themselves.
I think you're right, though. It's not going to go to the degree that the Judy Miller thing went. I mean, she might get some criticism, but it's not going to be, exile.
Yeah, I mean, you can replace, a faceless front page national security reporter much more easily than you can replace a valuable, famous cable news, face that Rachel is. She's worth hundreds of millions of dollars to Comcast, as evidenced by her $10 million a year contract. And you don't just throw that away the way you could throw away a Judy Miller and just put someone in her place who will do the same thing.
Can you summarize the major bombshell reporting that The Intercept did on Bolsonaro, the effect of it, and also on Lula? In 30 seconds.
So essentially, the biggest political presence in Brazil since 2014 has been this anti-corruption probe called Car Wash, that has resulted in the imprisonment of dozens of business leaders, billionaires, oligarchs, political leaders from multiple parties. And the biggest head on the pike was the former two-term highly popular president Lula da Silva. And the judge who oversaw that process and who endorsed all kinds of highly controversial practices that had never been previously used in Brazil, Sergio Moro, after he found Lula guilty on very dubious charges and then sentenced him to a decade in prison, which resulted in Lula's not being able to run for president in 2018 at a time when all polls showed that he would win if he were to run, including beating Bolsonaro by a substantial amount. The judge who removed Lula from the race by finding him guilty, which paved the way for Bolsonaro to win, then accepted a position as basically the highest ranking member of Bolsonaro's government, as a very powerful minister of justice and public security, where all the powers of law enforcement, surveillance, and investigation were consolidated under him. And our source hacked into the telephones of the prosecutors, and as they were communicating with the judge, for years worth of communications. It's an archive that he gave us that is bigger than the Snowden archive. And we were able to show that there was just systemic corruption on the part of these prosecutors who were idealized and turned into heroes, as well as Sergio Moro, who's probably the most popular and powerful person in Brazil. And it eventually led to the freeing of Lula, as well as dozens of other prisoners. It's going to lead to the disciplining and removal of the head prosecutor. And it really destabilized the Bolsonaro government because of how critical Sergio Moro is to that government.
Can you talk about the situation in Brazil and how you kind of experienced it personally? You mentioned about how there have been so many threats against you. You were also, like, someone hit you on radio. I mean, there was video footage of them hitting you while you were on the radio.
Você é covarde, Augusto Nunes. Você é covarde.
Que isso? Calma. Parou. Que isso?
É isso aí.
Peraí, calma.
Eu te mostro quem tem coragem. Não, aí não. Eu te mostro quem tem.
Peraí, vamos cortar. Cabide, pode cortar, vamos tocar uma música aqui.
Which, of course,
It was reported as a fight.
It was a fist fight broke out. Like, it was the worst both sizing I've seen in a while. And also how your role as, like, how fatherhood has changed or not changed, I guess, the way you experience politics and your own personal decisions, especially in terms of the danger in living in Brazil.
Well, it's interesting. I think one of the things that people don't realize about Bolsonaro, like when they constantly compare him to Trump or to like the far right leaders of Western Europe, like Marine Le Pen or Nigel Farage or those kind of people, is he's actually much different in a lot of different ways. He's really more of a throwback to this Cold War right-wing authoritarian who's obsessed with murdering communists.
Right. And
But
torturing them.
Yeah, and torturing them and then murdering them. And he's also a religious fanatic, and anti-LGBT hatred is a central part of his political success, because Brazil is a very religious country. It's the largest Catholic country in the world, but it's much more fanatical in a religious sense because of the growing evangelical movement that has really taken over large swaths of Brazilian politics. And Bolsonaro's success in demagoguing LGBT equality, he, basically convinced a large percentage of the population that public schools are now geared toward teaching children about homosexuality in order to convert them so that gay teachers can fuck their young children, which is, like playing with the most dangerous primal fears and instincts that people have. And one of the reasons why the reporting that I did was so dangerous is because my husband in January of 2019 kind of took center stage when the only LGBT member of the Brazilian Congress in the history of the Congress who had been elected, who was a dedicated enemy of the Bolsonaro family, who had spit on them, who had been threatened by them, fled the country out of fear of his own life. And David, because he ran for Congress and became the alternate, automatically by law took that seat. So it was like one LGBT member of Congress fled the country in fear of his own life. Bolsonaro that day posted "Great day," like celebrating the fact that he fled. And then David took his seat, elevated us as a gay couple into this like really bright spotlight at exactly the moment that Bolsonaro assumed the presidency, and his spawns, the sons, like Saddam Hussein's sons, like elevated themselves greatly in their own power. Like one got elected to the Senate, the other one got the biggest vote in the history of the Congress. So the Bolsonaro family assumed great power, and David and I became probably the most visible LGBT couple even before this reporting began. And then once we started publishing these leaked conversations, so much of the attacks were anti-gay in nature, and not just anti-gay, but, dragging our kids into the spotlight. And it's interesting that you mentioned, like, my new experience of being a father. We adopted, 2 young boys in 2017. When Bolsonaro threatened to imprison me explicitly, he also, in the same press conference, claimed that David and I had married fraudulently and had adopted 2 Brazilian boys, and he emphasized boys. fraudulently in order for me to avoid being deported, because under deportation law, if you're married to a Brazilian citizen or you've adopted or are the parent of two Brazilian children, you can't be deported. So he dragged our family into it, said our family was essentially a fraud. He called us tricksters. Yeah, and then the right-wing host who attacked me physically, the reason why that was such a tense interview was because 6 weeks before I appeared on that right-wing radio program, which, by the way, I also do that in Brazil. It's like a very popular right-wing radio and YouTube TV program. I appeared on there 6 weeks earlier. That pro-Bolsonaro journalist had gone on his own program and said that a judge should investigate whether David and I are properly caring for our children, essentially saying that there's a possibility that our children should be taken away from us, put back into the orphanage from which we adopted them. And one of the reasons why I was so animated and so angry sitting next to him was because this paternal instinct that I honestly didn't know that I had kicked in. And it was like I was sitting next to the person who was essentially calling for our children to be taken away from us and returned to an orphanage. And when I called him a coward for using our children that way and for refusing to say the same thing about his coworkers or his bosses, where both couples, the people in the couple both work, whether they should have their children taken away out of, concern that they're not properly caring for their children. He only said it about us. That's when he physically assaulted me. And it wasn't just that he physically assaulted me, but Bolsonaro's sons, his guru, many members of his party went on Twitter and celebrated the fact that I was, slapped in the face. They said next time it should be done with a closed fist or the violence should be worse. So there's a lot of political violence in the air in Brazil. It's a very dangerous political movement. And there's just no one that would dispute that the reporting we did was by far the biggest threat to that government in 2019. And I became the public face of it along with David. And the fact that we were an openly LGBT couple with 2 children, kind of a living embodiment of the proof that their attempt to stigmatize and demonize what it means to live an LGBT life, trying to convince LGBT youth that their futures are going to be filled with solitude and disease and unhappiness. We're kind of proof that that's a lie. It just stimulated so much more hatred and made it more primal and violent. I haven't left my house since June without armed guards and an armored vehicle, nor has David. We had to drastically enhance the security measures in our own house. Our kids are very aware of that. It radically changed our lives in every conceivable way. But that's what it means to do actual resistance against a fascist government.
How do your kids, have you heard them describing you and David's roles and describing the political situation? Have you ever heard them doing that, or do they talk about it with you? Do you have any sense of how they understand what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Kids who grow up without parents, as ours did, develop faculties and skills that I never had when I was their age, because I relied on my mother and father to protect me and to monitor the world for dangers and to teach me about what was going on. Kids who grow up without parents have to develop these. It's kind of like, if someone's blind, their hearing becomes enhanced. Obviously, it's a tragic thing for kids to grow up without parents, but there is this kind of, I don't want to call it a benefit, but like a result, they develop capacities that other kids don't have. And so our kids are incredibly perceptive, and they just fit so perfectly into our lives. They're very charismatic. They're very charming. They're very smart.
They like dogs.
Yeah, they were a little wary of some of the dogs at first, but they even love the dogs now. So yeah, they're really proud of us. Some kids in school have made, pejorative comments occasionally about us, and they almost got into fights over it. And we talked to them about how you can debate with words, but not with fists. So yeah, they're very aware. Yeah, they're very aware of all of that.
One thing I wanted to ask you about, I mean, you're going through something that very few journalists in the United States ever have to experience, sort of immediate, at least the ones who work entirely within the country. What do you think living overseas and in that kind of environment has done in terms of your perspective on reporting on the United States? Do you think it's enhanced it in a way, or what do you think the experience of living abroad has done for you?
Yeah, I think it's been incredibly beneficial for my work as a journalist, being having distance between New York and Washington, and then me thousands of miles away. For one thing, it means that I'm not constantly interacting with people who are immersed in elite political and journalistic culture. So I'm not constantly connected to it. We're all influenced by the people we talk to, the people who are around us. And so kind of having this distance from it, I think, has enabled me to have some greater independence. It also gives you a different perspective. I mean, I remember after living in Brazil for 2 or 3 years, I just woke up one day, I don't know why this insight came to me, but I just realized, it seems kind of banal, but at the time it seemed like an epiphany. I realized there's never a moment in Brazilian political discourse, and Brazil is a big country. It's the 5th most populous country on the planet. It has 220 million people, so just a few less than the U.S. has. It's comparable in geographical size to the U.S. It has tons of oil reserves. It's of geostrategic importance. It's the most influential country on the continent. And yet there's never a moment where there's any discussion of which country should we bomb? Should we go to war with this country? Should we drop bombs on this country? Should we send? And so when you kind of remove yourself from the U.S., you start to realize that certain things that are just taken for granted as normal in the U.S. are actually incredibly abnormal, really kind of rogue in the sense that almost nobody else does it. And then, I think that also the way I built my journalism career, starting my own blog, and then always negotiating for the right to just not be edited, the fact that I have my own independent following that gives me a kind of leverage and platform has just kind of contributed to my ability to be independent and not have to, please and appease the people who wield power in the world of journalism.
Fantastic.
And are you paid in rubles, by the way? What's
I
the
was going to
currency?
say, what's your favorite part of the Russian assets benefit package?
Well, I was going to ask you guys whether you're going to pay me the rubles you promised me by wire transfer or check, or how that works.
Yeah.
So, you guys know better than I.
Yeah, we'll work it. Matt definitely knows, yeah.
Yeah, Matt was in Moscow for how many years, Matt, that all that compromat was compiled about you?
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm the liaison.
Yeah,
so.
exactly.
Glenn, thank you so much for coming
so
on.
much,
I think
yes.
I think Katie and I both would agree that what you're doing is both impactful. It's incredibly brave. I hope you're taking care of yourself and taking precautions. I've actually worried about you a couple of times over the last year. Keep it up, but be safe.
Yeah, be safe.
Yeah, you guys are doing great work, and I really appreciate your finally inviting me on.
You should tell your kids. What'd you say?
Finally, he said.
You should tell your kids that you should be you can just, instead of using your fist, you can use your words and call people covardi, or covardi, however you say it, covardi.
No, it's good. You say it like I say it, which is like a horrible gringo accent.
All right, so, I'm going to say it well now. Covardi.
Very good, very good. All right.
Glenn,
all right, guys.
So
thank you, guys. Keep up the great work. All right, appreciate it. Bye.